Hi everyone and welcome. How many of you have heard the same rule, perhaps from an art teacher? Don't use black or white in your painting. There's no such colour as black or white. It doesn't exist in nature, so don't use it in your painting. Well, I too have heard this rule from an art teacher, and I do understand where it's coming from, but also I'd like to show you lots of ways in which I break these rules all the time and why it's okay. So I hope you enjoy the video. If you haven't already, please do subscribe to me here on YouTube, and also check me out over on my Patreon channel for much more in-depth long tutorials and lots more. Enjoy the video. So where did I hear about this rule? Well, I'm 11 years old, I've just started high school and I'm starting art classes, and our art teacher gives everyone in the class one of these Reeves boxes of watercolours. It's very messy, I've had it since I was 11 and it's got a lot of use, but as she gave us it, she pointed out that we should really avoid using the black. Believe it or not, that's white. We should avoid using both of those colours. And she suggested, instead of using black, that you mix a deep red, a deep blue and a deep green, and that you'll get a much more rich, dark black colour. And as well as that, it's kind of pointless having the white in the watercolours. You work the opposite to pastel, for example, where it's dark to light. With watercolour, you're thinking of your light highlights almost first, quite often, and a lot of watercolour artists will use the white of the paper to create their brightest highlight. So if you're talking about this black and white rule in regards to watercolours, it does make a lot of sense. Having said that though, I do know some great watercolour artists who come in at the end of their piece with some black ink, and it looks amazing. So every rule can be broken successfully. But let's talk about my medium, soft pastel, for a minute. And it's completely different with this because I'm working from dark to light, so I want all my deepest, darkest values on the paper first, and then I build it up with my brightest highlights going on last. And sometimes, especially when I'm painting pets, I can definitely see a lot of black in some of the reference images that I'm working from. And with pastel, I can confidently put a lot of solid black. I use the Faber Castell black sticks. They are the most jet black that I can find in a pastel. And they're also a little bit harder. Sometimes I use them on the early layers. But I'm quite happy to put down a lot of black pastel early on in the painting. But with this piece, for example, there are some areas where it's extremely jet black, where there's really no light penetrating. But then, if you look at the other black areas, I've used lots of other colours in there, like deep browns, and also some greys with a lot of blue or green in it. And I've used those colours to break up those black areas and soften them. So with pastel, I'm happy to come in with the black first, but I'll often come back over the top of the black and break it up, add more interest to it rather than leaving it all solid black. Now let's discuss the lighter colours. There aren't that many highlights in this piece. The only one place that I used a little bit of actual white pastel is on this highlight in the eye. So for all the other highlighted areas, it's lighter warm greys, beiges, light creams, but saving pure white for just that one area where it's really bright. And if anything, that's my biggest bit of advice. The colour that you've got to look out for using too much, to me it's white. So I'm a lot less worried about using a lot of black because I know that I can come back over that colour and liven it up a bit. But when you come in with too much white, so if you use white to make all of your tones lighter, if you use white as the way to do that, you're gonna find that your image gets very flat. The direction of light, the 3D element of your painting, you'll lose that if you use white all over the painting to highlight. So out of the two, I would say be most careful with your use of white. And we're going to take a look at a few examples, some alternatives that you can use instead of white and black, and some ways that you can incorporate this into your own work. So we'll have a look at a few examples of previous pieces that I've done. But first, let's talk about some colours you can use to avoid using white or black. And while we're at it, let's talk about grey as well, and I'll come to that in a second. Let's start off with white here. So we've got pure white, and I do make use of pure white, but I'm very sparing with it, so I'll really look at the image and see where it's got the most bright highlight possible, and sometimes that will be my pure white. But all of these other colours are just some of the other colours that I can substitute for my brightest highlight when it's required. A more earthy colour, white with a lot of yellow in it. This is actually one of my favourite alternatives to use for white. It's got a lot more warmth to it. And then adding even more warmth with this, right through to adding a tint of green. Minty greeny blue, a sort of taupey grey, bringing us right into lilacs, right through to a very pale blue, which is BV7, and that's one of my favourite lightest highlights to use in the shadow areas. So in the sunlit areas I may have my pure white as the highlights, and then in the shadow areas I'll use something with a lot more cool blue in it. So I use a lot of different colours to substitute for white. And if you're using white in place of all of these other colours and just using white, you're going to find your work gets very flat looking. If you can save your white, pure white, for where it really truly is exposed enough to warrant using pure white, then your work's going to have a lot more depth and a lot more colour in it. So when we talk about white, grey and black, I'm really thinking in terms of monochrome, like if I were working with graphite. But when I pick up my pastels, then I try to see everything a bit differently with a lot more colour injected to it. So even with grey, I try and avoid very monochrome type greys, and I'll choose greys with a tint of green or lilac, right through to quite vibrant blues in place of my greys. And sometimes when I need warmth, you'll get sort of fleshy pinks and other colours in place of my greys. So even with this colour, I'm always trying to find something a little more interesting to represent the tonal value in my painting. As long as you get the tonal values within your painting right, you can really go for any tint, any hue that you want. That's where a lot of artists find their own unique palette creates a very recognisable style for each artist. And finally through to black then, so we've got pure black, and a lot of the time I'm going back through my black areas with deep navy colours, deep purples through to deep plummy purples into the browns. Sometimes I'll be using deep greens to break up my black, but always looking for something with more hue value to it than just these plain monochrome colours. So let's have a talk about a few pieces that I've painted where I can show you what I mean. Now this piece in particular, I've used a lot of both black and white. You can see the two extremes from bright to dark areas in this one painting. So if I do a little effect here, I can actually show you by selecting the black area. And you can see in this little image over here, it highlights all the places it can find black. So I've used quite a lot of black in this piece. There's a lot of depth in behind the pots. And you would think that I'd probably used a lot of white in this piece as well, but let's see how much white comes up. So we'll choose some of this brighter area on top. And you can see that I've mainly used the white around the tops of the dog's ears, the top of the dog's head, and down this side where the light is catching. But on the rest of the dog, I've been using all of those other light colours, all of my white substitutes, those light tints.
So it's surprising how little white was actually used in this piece. So another example, just to talk briefly about landscape. I will in fact use some black in the landscape, but my main tip is to keep your black or any darkest values for your foreground area. As you disappear into the distance in a landscape, you should find that all of your colours get slightly lighter as the land recedes into the distance. And just to note, I didn't actually use any white in this piece. You'll hardly ever find pure white in a sunset landscape. If you ever look at anything that's been hit by the setting sun, it usually shines orange colours, so absolutely no white in this piece. And just lastly, what better way to show you use of white, grey and black than on two grey schnauzers. So again, I have used white in this piece around the very sunlit areas on the dogs. You'd be surprised at the array of different lilacs and blues that I've used throughout the grey areas of their coats. And I have made use of some solid black, like on the collars here. But let's show you just how much colour is actually in this piece. If we set this to grayscale, so we put it into monochrome, discard all the colour, and you can see what a difference that makes. So that's pure white, black and monochrome grey together. But you can see how much extra colour is in the actual painting. So you're always looking for substitutes for those colours. You can make use of them. You can see that I use both black and white a lot in my work, but it's knowing to be a bit more restrained and knowing exactly where to use them. I hope you find this helpful. That is my rant about black and white over. You can use them, you just need to be sure to balance them within the rest of the picture and not overuse them. Remember, rules are great, but sometimes it's a lot of fun to break them. Until next time, happy pasteling.